Welcome back, everyone. Happy Friday. Thanks for joining us. Give Jim a sec to get this thing on the Facebook. All right. We're out on Facebook land now, too. Okay, so welcome, everyone. Happy Friday. Happy hour. Happy Friday. Welcome back to another virtual tasting with Binny's. I am Pat, along with Brett from the Whiskey Hotline. Our guest today is Jay, our friend Jay from New Riff Distilling down in, what town are you in technically? Covington? Not Covington.
Newport.
Newport.
Yeah,
I think them's fighting words between Covington and if you confuse Covington and Newport.
I always confuse those two.
Newport and
Right?
Bellevue. Our distillery is on the very border. We are the border of Newport and Bellevue. Our sidewalk is the border. So we are technically in Newport. And
that works out great for the government. You get to pay taxes to two different towns.
Chapter Bellevue's asked that we built the distillery on that side instead of that side. But we're in Newport, Kentucky.
Great. Well,
right across the river from Cincinnati, the home of great chili, as we know.
Almost something that besmirches the name chili, but I suppose that's for another conversation. Jay and I have had the chili talk before. Jay's been on our podcast, Barrel to Bottle. If you don't listen to it, get it wherever you can get a podcast. So, Jay, you co-founded New Riff. How long ago was that?
We opened in 2014, started distilling 2014, June. We just celebrated tasting a couple weeks ago, I guess about 10 days ago, a 6-year-old whiskey. Couldn't believe it.
That is exciting.
We have just a few barrels left from that first batch that we did, of course, hang on to. And in fact, we didn't bottle anything out of the first batch, come to think of it. We just socked it all away. And so we were 6 years old. Can't believe it. We're not, by the way, not releasing any 6-year-old for some time. And I'm not even sure if the next older thing will be 6, but lest anyone say, can I get a private barrel of that?
Yeah, that just eliminated the first 10 questions off of Facebook, so that's good.
No, well, we're setting back about 30% of what we make annually to become older. Just how older, I don't know. 6, 7, it might be 8, and it'll be out someday.
That's great. Let the whiskey do the talking, right?
Right.
So something of age, though, there. You guys have always been pretty staunch from the get-go that you're going to let the whiskey, age to what we would consider as professionals' maturity. You're using only big barrels. You're getting everything to at least 4 years old.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, everything that isn't barrel strength is bottled and bond, right?
That's right. That's our flagship products, really, these bottled and bond without chill filtration whiskeys. And every one of them has got an age statement on the back. 4 years old. We like age statements. I get why some people don't like them. And I'm not even talking about the people who don't like them because they want to sell things under that.
Yeah.
But people certainly get hung up on age statements and think that a younger whiskey can't be good enough. And that goes for Scotch as well as bourbon, of course. But we like the disclosure to the customer, to the consumer. For the one person who says, 4 years old, give me an 8-year-old. First of all, go out and find me an 8-year-old bourbon. And not very many of them anymore. Mm-hmm. And number 2, we think 9 more people will say thank you for respecting us, telling us how old this is. And by the way, I can't believe it's that good for just 4 years old. And that's the compliment we hear with some regularity. And it tickles me every time I hear it because it tells us that we really did our job. We succeeded in setting out to make good young whiskey. Mm-hmm. But it will get
won a lot of awards and a lot of good attention because of that too.
Yeah. Well, and the idea is when you're starting to construct and decide what the image is going to be, it first and foremost, you have to be driven by what's in the bottle. And everything that goes on the label is just really an afterthought after you've determined what you need to get on the bottle. So
right on.
Yeah. So you guys are making bourbon and rye. And again, you talked about it being bottled and bond. You mentioned non-chill filtration. I know that's kind of a touch point for a lot of whiskey nerds these days, and I know you've got pretty strong feelings on that. There's no reason to be.
So I have been accused.
So, despite these kind of traditional ideals of 4 years, full-size barrels, doing bourbon and rye, you still got some room for experimentation down there. And that's kind of what we wanted to talk about today, was this Backsetter Series, which recently came in. You want to kind of break down the idea and the process behind this?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So Backsetter. Backsetter was, I won't say it's an accident at all. We did it on purpose, but we didn't go into it thinking it would come out like this and taste like this. What happened was in the spring of 15, I guess, we found ourselves in possession of some backset from a peated malted barley mash. And so that means we made a peated malted barley whiskey. And we had this backset. And let's pardon me, back up a minute and make sure everyone knows what backset is. So we are committed, like another piece of our religion, to sour mash whiskey making at New Riff. We think that's the way Kentucky whiskey ought to be made. It's the process that Kentucky really brings to the world of whiskey. And so here we are making sour mash whiskey. Every day we distill X number of batches, it's 3 actually, of whiskey. And the beer, the mash goes through the still and the alcohol goes out the top. And the beer goes out the bottom of the still and it goes into a tank. And we call it stillage. And most of that goes away to a farmer, but some of it we strain over a screen. We separate the thinner part out, what we call thin stillage. And we set that back, or as the old time distillers would say, they backset it. So that's backset, and that goes into the mash. About 25% of it, of the liquid volume in the mash, is the backset, and so that's how we sour mash. And so this one day, you see every batch of whiskey has to go into the next one. In fact, side note, here we are 6 years later from our first batch of whiskey. Our first batch of whiskey was not bourbon, and not rye either. No, it was a corn whiskey. Because the first day we started up, where did we get any stillage? You couldn't order it on Amazon. Yeah. So how do we get stillage? We made a sacrificial victim out of a batch of corn whiskey because we refused to make any bourbon or any rye with sweet mash or start up on water, as the old time distiller said. So we started up on water, made a corn whiskey. We took the corn whiskey out back, we shot it in the head, and we took its stillage and made bourbon. So the very first whiskey, the oldest whiskey we have, is a corn whiskey. Pretty good corn whiskey, actually. It's about 18% rye. So it's pretty good. Anywho, so we have this stillage from peated malted barley. And I distinctly remember the conversation of our assistant distiller, David Miller. He's been with us from the beginning. And David asked our head distiller, Brian Sprance, brilliant guy, Brian. And he is really the one there supervising the whiskey making every day. Certainly not me. And David asked Brian, we were all standing there in the distillery, he said something to the effect of, hey boss, do you want us to put that peated backset in the mashes today, in the bourbon and the rye mash? And Brian said, I won't use his exact words because this is a family show. But he said something to the effect of, screw it, put it in, let it ride, like this. And we cast caution to the wind and made peated backset whiskey. Fast forward 4.5 or so years. And actually this was in November of 15, the first one. And here we are in the sensory lab tasting these whiskeys. And we come across one and look around the table and look at each other and say, this is really smoky. I mean, once in a while we get some smoky whiskey, a gently smoky barrel, but these things are, and then it dawned on us, oh my goodness, this is that peated backset. And we checked the mashes, and sure enough, here we were sampling. We didn't forget about it. We knew it was there, but that day we weren't going into it knowing that was the next batch of samples. It took us by surprise a little bit. And so we had made peated backset whiskey. The interesting thing about peated backset whiskey, or any backset really, is why do you sour mash? And furthermore, what does it do? Because when you add backset, there's nothing in it that can become whiskey, or that by chemistry can flavor the whiskey. There's no sugars in it, right? Because we did our jobs and fermented the corn mash, the rye mash, fermented that sweet mash into alcohol, into a beer, and then we distilled that. We took out all the alcohol, so there's no sugar in Backset, and there's no alcohol in Backset because we also did our job. We took all the alcohol out to become whiskey. What is it in that Backset that can flavor a whiskey? And even our best minds, and even people like our master distiller consultant, Sensei, that got us started at New Riff, Larry Ebersol, probably the best sour mash whiskey maker in the bourbon business. And he explains how it improves things, but up to a point, he says, after that, I got no idea, because there's nothing in there that can come out and flavor the whiskey. And so how did this stuff flavor the whiskey? It is a dramatic proving of what Backset or what sour mashing can do. I have a sample of Backsetter here. I'm not going to open that bottle. That's going back to the distillery. We're going to sell it. How does it flavor the whiskey? And there you go. Yeah, see, I don't have a rye at hand. I just have the bourbon. It's a bit of a mystery how sour mash flavors the whiskey, but it does. And what our Backsetter proves is offers dramatic proof of that. You know, here it is manifestly peaty. It is not peated bourbon. This does not say peated bourbon. When you make a peated bourbon, you add peated barley to the mash. And look at the mash bill. It's on the back. Same mash bill as everything else we make. 65 corn, 30% rye, 5% malted barley. That is the mash bill. Nary a grain of peated barley went into this beer, and yet it is dramatically peaty.
Well, so go back to, because you talk about Backset there. What was traditionally, there were different reasons that could be given for using Backset to make sour mash, and
Sure.
You hear things like everything from everybody's cheap and you don't want to waste any liquid, and it's one way to get at least part of your stillage involved, to pH balancing, to consistency from batch to batch to batch. So at some point in time in there, that peated component that's still in the stillage has to have some influence over the fermentation, because that's where that would have to come along, right?
Right. Well, yeah, all of the above are reasons for sour mashing. Another one is energy conservation. You've got this tank full of boiling hot liquid that you just distilled. Let's use a bunch of it and save some energy, and also save, which of course is saving fuel costs, but also save time, because you don't have to spend as much time heating up cold water. Our well water is 58 degrees. So having 190 degree stillage acts as a buffer there, and then it doesn't take as much time to come up and boil the mash. It makes a small pH adjustment. Some folks have theorized that there are assorted compounds in the stillage, the Backset, that are beneficial for the yeast. There's some yeast hulls in there, perhaps some leftover nutrients. The other reason is flavor, and Kentucky's distillers found it made better whiskey. In fact, side note to stillage, and this also compounds upon what New Riff does, but if you go and look, search online and go and read or talk to some of the old time master distillers, veterans of the industry will tell you, man, the best bourbon we ever make at such and so Kentucky distillery is the one after we mash rye. After we make rye, that's the best bourbon. Of course, they make rye. They used to make it one day a year. And now with the rye renaissance, these huge distilleries are up to, I don't know, 5 or 6 days a year, perhaps. Well, at New Riff, we run the distillery 4 days a week, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. Monday and Tuesday, we almost always mash rye, and they ferment for only 3 days. Bourbon, we mash on Thursday and Friday when we distill the rye, right? So what that means is almost every batch of New Riff bourbon is backset with New Riff rye.
And then theoretically vice versa.
Vice versa, yes.
So you're backsetting your rye.
The rye is almost always backset with bourbon.
So any amount of backset you're keeping, though, from the previous batch is getting used with that next batch. It's not like what they would do in Jamaica with like a dunder pit, where it's this constantly evolving tank, right?
No, it's used fresh every day, right?
Okay.
Yeah, you can't really store, right? Because it's the same principle as dunder. There's a difference between, I mean, a dunder pit turns into a dunder pit for a reason, and I would imagine if you kept enough
Those
backset
distillers
laying
that's
around
just kept
for
around.
days and weeks and months, that it would turn into a
Well,
bourbon dunder pit.
Dunder becomes dunder because they throw goats in it and things like that. Rotten fruit. And I love me some Dunder Pit rum. It's my favorite kind of rum. No, that does not happen at all. We have on occasion, when we shut down the distillery, which usually about every year we have to shut down for something, like take a week off, clean some things, do some heavy maintenance. Last September, we had to close for about 2 weeks to replace the well pump, the pump on our well. So when that happens, we have to start up on water. And usually when we do, we start up with a non-bourbon or rye recipe. Heck, this year we might start up to make hand sanitizer again. We distilled a 100% corn mash to make our hand sanitizer.
So where'd the peated mash come into play? Was that a similar thing post startup that you guys decided to run that peated mash?
No, the peated mash was just made in our regular production cycle.
Okay.
It was a 100%. It was actually imported from Scotland, and we distilled that. It is also sour mashed. It'll come out someday.
So peated barley that got run through the column still there.
Correct.
Where is that whiskey?
In our warehouse.
Because this is now we're getting, and that's not even really it's Scottish barley, but now you're getting Japanese, because you're really Japanese or Loch Lomond, because you're talking about running a malt mash through a column still, which is a very Japanese thing to do, and really in Scotland isn't done a lot except for a few at a facility like Loch Lomond, which does it on purpose. Even though technically they have to call it grain. You know, it's a lot different than typical grain, yeah.
Right.
That's really interesting. Curious to see how that tastes years from now. Speaking of years from now, somebody on Facebook, Joe Nedler on Facebook, asked if there were plans to gradually make new Riff an older age statement. You kind of touched on that before. Your lead and stuff age. Do you see that 4-year age statement on the core stuff creeping up, or
right?
Great, you're going to keep it as is?
Yeah, good question. It will probably stay as is, but I'd love to see it migrate up to 5. Mm-hmm. That's not easy to do because it means we have to hold back, everything we would sell for next year now. And I'm not sure if it needs to. We are continually getting better over the years. And what I mean by that is when we opened in 2014, which you guys had some of our early whiskey, I think it was good whiskey, but it got better as time went on, as we learned our process, tinkered with the equipment a little bit, made the still run more smoothly, put in a few more control points, things like that. And I'm not sure we want to make a blanket statement that, well, it's got to be older. If it could be, that'd be fun, but I think it'll always probably stay 4. Mm-hmm. It will never go under that.
Good.
Well, and you can kind of try again. You're basing again, it's getting away from the obsession with numbers. You're basing your bottlings on what you like. I mean, ultimately, and what you like and what is good. And in terms of critical reception, you seem to be on the right track, because people love, people are loving what we've got on the shelves and what you're selling. So
thank you. So I haven't heard from you guys yet. What do you think of Backsetter bourbon?
I just took my first taste of rye. So funny story about Backsetter bourbon. We didn't get a whole lot, and a unmentioned member of the team may have not pulled a bottle a few weeks ago when it came in, and it has
who's absolutely not here to defend himself.
Who's absolutely not here to defend himself, and it is subsequently sold out. So yeah. I've got the rye. I did not get a chance to taste the bourbon. So you're going to have to break down the bourbon, and we'll give you our thoughts on the rye.
As a timeline, folks, we were supposed to talk to Jay 3 weeks ago. Unfortunately, there was some civil unrest that was going on all over the country, and we thought it better to cancel that and postpone it until everything was a little bit more calm, which is why we're here today talking about a product that we've actually sold out of for the most part.
Sorry about that.
It is what it is. I'm glad that a lot of people got to get a bottle of this in theory. So we do have rye left at a limited amount of stores. Check Vinny's.com for that. So you use the same backset for both the rye and the bourbon.
Yes, although there is a slight difference. So we only made the one, and this is going to get pretty geeky here, but that's fun. So we only had one batch of the peated backset, and the backset collected from one whiskey will go into the next batch, and then as we begin distilling the next whiskey, that is also collected. And so suppose you have a tank that's this full of backset, thin stillage, that what's going in to become sour mash, and we start mashing that whiskey, and we take a bunch of that, and it goes into the mash, into the cooker. Meanwhile, as the next batch is getting distilled, the thin stillage is filling up. So between the two whiskeys, there was a difference in which one got that full pot of the backset, of the peated backset. And actually the rye was the first whiskey that we mashed on that day. So I'll have to get you guys a sample someday, maybe when you're at the distillery, certain, in the long off future. We'll be sure and find, we have a sample of it somewhere, I'm sure. Well, heck, I have a sample right here. And I'll make sure you guys get a taste someday. But take my word for it, the rye is a little bit peatier than the bourbon. The bourbon is a little bit more pulled back on the peat. The sliders on the mixing board is an analogy I use sometimes, are set a little bit differently. It's a little rounder, obviously less spicy, but there is a slight difference in what they got.
But that actually works. It just for like wood and everything else, about peated whiskey, that probably works better, that the more aggressive notes were attached to the more aggressive grain, because rye by nature is going to be spicier anyway. So seems to me that just is a layer of complexity rather than overpowering. I wonder if there wouldn't have been a worry that had you done bourbon first, it would have almost overpowered.
Might have overpowered.
Been a little it would have been a little one note on the peat, maybe.
So I will say with the rye, I was in the office with Brett 2 days ago, I guess, and cracked open this bottle, and it immediately kind of smacked me in the face a bit. I didn't expect it to smell that peaty, but I didn't taste it. I opened the bottle, smelled it, and I poured some into a small sample bottle I had sitting around that I could take home and taste today. And it seems to have calmed down a bit, versus when I first cracked the bottle, which I suppose is to be expected. But there's a noticeable peat to it. And it's interesting that, we talk about backset having no flavor, but there's obviously something in there. And I wonder, I've heard anecdotally with peated Scotch whiskeys that some unpeated Scotch whiskeys still get a peat-like character to them because their water source is near a peat bog, or the water is filtered through peat before it gets into this aquifer or spring or whatever they're drawing water out of. And so it can still have an earthy peat character that's kind of attached to the water and not the grain. And I thought that, that seems like a good story to tell distillery visitors. So I never really gave it that much credence. But there's definitely unpeated Scotch whiskeys that have a distinct earthy note to them. Certainly something like Brookladdy comes to mind. First and foremost. But what do you think about
Well, sure. Well, Bunnahabhain, I mean, the majority of what Bunnahabhain produces and the majority of what Kalila produces right now are both, even though they're on Islay, are unpeated. And I think that sometimes people confuse too. They don't, especially people that aren't fans or people whose only experience is something like Lafroig, which is on the aggressive side, don't necessarily understand that the peat isn't just all about smoke. And I think you hit on it, Pat, because you just said earthy. Pizza, and like this, I think you smell a little bit more of the forward smoke character than I get on the palate. I don't think that the smoke piece of it is aggressive as much as that minerality. I don't know whether it's almost like bordering like saline character, earthy, bitter chocolate, that sort of thing that sort of blends with the spice.
I think the rye is a little softer and breadier than the standard New Riff rye, which is a very well balanced rye. Like I wouldn't call it lean and spicy. It's obviously a rye, but it has balance. And this is a little rounder, I think. It's a little more plush.
It's distinctly bready. Sometimes we get batches of rye that, and we see this when we are internally tasting all the lots and tasting almost every barrel, that the rye expresses in a more grassy direction, sometimes mineral direction, grassy, bready kind of thing. Not so much the cinnamon, the clove, the pink peppercorn, the mint, but this bready rye quality. And I think that is in part what's going on here in this batch of Backsetter. We didn't intend it that way. It's just the way that rye came out as a rye. But I agree, Brett, that if I'm going to throw peat on there, or more peat, I'd rather it have to meet up with, you know, the spiciness of a rye whiskey, which is probably going to take care of itself.
Yeah, yeah. So have you made the peated malt whiskey again? Is there going to be more of this down the road, you think?
Well, I can tell you for sure we're making more Backsetter this year.
Okay.
Because it's amazing and we want more.
Yeah.
We got a trademark on it. So on the name. So we're making more peated Backset this year. And that means, well, we've got to make more peated whiskey, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and
Now,
it keeps you from having to do a throwaway batch too. I mean, if you have to do a maintenance shutdown, instead of wasting your throwaway batch, why not, right?
is this something you can see expanding? I mean, I don't know what the upper threshold for amount of noticeable nuance and flavor you could get out of just experimenting with Backset, but I would imagine to a distiller it's worth trying.
Yes, totally. This is absolutely a technique we would, I mean, it's not a technique. It's merely a very intentional use of what Backset goes into what whiskey, which, by the way, we trace obsessively, not for these purposes of making Backsetter, just for being consistent and for knowing what's going on in our distillery. Our distillers maintain a log of each grind and cook and logs of each fermentation all the way through pH and temperature and everything, sugar content. And so we know exactly what was backset into with what. And it would be fun to say, all right, well, rye whiskey makes a really nice backset for bourbon. What about malted rye? Because we make malted rye, as I think you know. We make a day's worth of malted rye once a month at New Riff. So let's backset some bourbon with that. Let's see what that is like. And actually, we now need to sort of search our stocks and go out and see, well, what else did we make by accident? What else is sporting a flavor maybe that is obvious? However, obviously, peated whiskey is just about the most dramatically flavored whiskey in the world, and peated barley whiskey. And the others would be of a certainty much more subtle. But we'll see what we find. Yeah.
Yeah, that answered the question, which was going to be, and you guys have the benefit for those folks who've never been to Newport, or if you're in Cincinnati and you want to escape Ohio, you should drive across the bridge and go to the distillery, because the tasting room is fantastic. And if you have these little things that you're chasing down, it's nice to know that you have one place where you can assuredly go through a barrel of anything. Mm-hmm. Because you can always, if you have to, bottle them off and do something there at the tasting room, at the distillery door. Is there anything else that you've run into? Because it's, the story that you tell about the development is much the story that Bill Lumsden and the folks from Ardbeg tell about the genesis of the Supernova project, which is they're just trying barrels in the course of trying barrels to put together their next blend of Ardbeg 10 or Ardbeg Ugadal or whatever. And then all of a sudden they run in, it's like, oh my God, we found this whiskey that's super, super peaty. So because they track everything, they tracked back and found out, well, the day that this was produced, the spec was like 120 ppm instead of the typical 50 or 60 or 70 that they get. And okay, where are these barrels? So go back and find what the specs are of all the barley. That was the genesis of a project. Is there anything else that you're chasing, or in this case, it sounds like just randomly running into that? It's like, I wonder if there's anything else of this around.
Yeah, let me give you an example. So we make malted rye whiskey. 100% malted rye, and that'll come out someday.
So good, and we're waiting for it to be bottled.
That's
probably, you guys can see some next fall, 2021, tentatively. Knocking on my wood here. Malted rye, and one day in Well, the weather was bad. I think it was April, one of these like late snowstorms, and April 2015, I guess. And we couldn't get a delivery of rye. The truck couldn't come. We had to make whiskey. You know, we've got fermenters that we have to empty. We have to empty them and distill these. We got to fill them back up. So we have to make whiskey. We ran out of rye. We had pallets of malted rye sitting there. The malted rye went into bourbon. So we made malted rye bourbon. Fast forward 4 years. And what happens, but we are tasting again in our tasting room, and we say, gosh, this is really good, and it's different. And we went and looked it up. Sure enough, it was the malted rye bourbon. So yeah, there are some small little happy accidents like that have happened now and then. Hopefully they don't come up too often, because it means something happened 4 years ago. But in a sense, we don't want them to happen. We'd rather make things on purpose. Mm-hmm. And so we have done something like that.
Or you hope that if
the day the rye ran out whiskey.
Well, either that, or you hope that if you discover them, that you discover them and say, oh, well, at least it's good, right?
Yeah.
You know, you don't want to discover the ones that are truly a disaster in every single sense.
We don't find those, no.
Yeah, good. Well, you guys have pretty strict quality control anyway. I mean, I would imagine that you have less of a problem than a lot of mass production facilities, because you're so strictly controlling quality. I mean, you're catching that before it even goes into wood.
Yeah, you know, we don't see too many bum batches come off the still, and nothing that can't go into wood. Sometimes the proof is really in the pudding 4 years later, as we come across batches of whiskey that because of how we barrel, each fermenter is mostly put away all to its own barrels. It's discreetly barreled from each other one. And that means we can see the flavor 4 years later, not only from barrel to barrel to barrel, but from lot to lot, from 12 or 13 barrel batches to another. And each fermenter develops a little bit different fermentation, different flavor. So some of those we run across, we think this one is one we're going to hold back. It needs a little more time. It's just a little too young and hot yet, but it's still going to be a good whiskey someday. In fact, sometimes they will smell a little too hot, but damn, this tastes fantastic. Yeah, let's just set it back, and that becomes one of the things we hold for longer aging.
Cool.
So, I mean, speaking of that quality control, I know you guys take pretty great care with your sourcing of your grains, right? And you got some pretty personal relationships with some particular family farms.
With a farmer, yeah.
Yeah, you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So that was one of the early questions. You know, where are we going to source a grain supply? That probably was question number 2 after where will we source the water supply? And I already referenced our well that drives the distillery and provides us with a groundwater, a uniquely flavored groundwater that turns into the whiskey. But one of the early questions, number 2, might have been grain. And Larry Ebersol suggested you might want to get a hold of the guys at Four Roses, talk to them about their grain supply. I know they use a good one. And so I called up Jim Rutledge, and Jim said, call this number. And I'm writing it down, you know. And so I rang up their farmer, and his name is Charles Fogg. He's in Greensburg, Indiana. And he runs a variety of grain businesses, but for his whiskey stuff, we choose grain from his single family farm. It's non-GMO corn. It is rigorously cleaned. He does a genetics test on it. And in fact, he is trained by Seagram's chemists, ex-Seagram's people, ex-Four Roses people, that in the quality control, examination, and production of corn for whiskey making, not corn for animal feed or corn for ethanol distillation or anything else, corn to become tortilla chips. He is growing it for whiskey making. And so he's trained by some of the best in the business in how to do that. And we think he's the best farmer in the business. He also grows for us a variety of heirloom grains. He's got an heirloom rye. He grows a couple of heirloom corns at our request. It's just great to have a farmer we can go to and say, here, this corn here, see this one? Grow that one for us. And he doesn't just grow it. He's, like I said, the best in the biz. So he's been our grain supplier from day one for corn and a few other grains. Our rye comes from a company called Brooks Grain, and they're not a local farmer at all. Brooks is a fantastic company. They actually supply, I don't know how many, but most of the large distilleries in the bourbon business. And their grain is a commodity source from Northern Europe, except that we take a special slice of that. So our rye, here's a bottle of New Riff rye, and the grain bill is 95% rye, 5% malted rye. That is our riff on the 95.5 rye out of Indiana that our consultant sensei, Larry Ebersold, was actually the one who mastered. He created that recipe. He taught us the black arts of how to make that rye. One of the secrets to making 95% rye whiskey is you got to use the right rye. And it has to be very rigorously cleaned. So imagine there's an enormous pile of rye, as big as a Benny's, bigger. And that is feeding the Indiana distillery. It's also feeding us. We get the exact same spec of rye that Larry Ebersold came up with back in the mid-1990s when he created that rye in the first place.
Right. And then have you had any trouble sourcing that? Has that been an issue in the last, or you haven't had any source since that's coming over from you? You haven't had any difficulties in the last 3 months?
Oh, good question. No, we're fine. It comes by ship across the ocean and then comes up a barge through the rivers to Louisville. And no, we've been fine on that.
Okay. I'm always curious. And what's the storage time? How long when that comes? How long? Because corn will get siloed for a while. I know in Scotland in the Scotch business, you're basically working at least a year behind. You're typically a whole year's harvest behind. What is the silo time for a lot of these materials for you guys and for the business in general?
Right. No, well, they can both be stored a while. I mean, if you think about it, there's only a Northern European or an American rye harvest once a year. It's actually harvested in the later summer. Our local rye will start to be harvested here in a few weeks, I think. And so it gets siloed until, for up to a year. It doesn't stay around in our silo very long. And I think the places that store it can take extra care, ventilation and maybe even temperature control or something like that to store it a long time.
Well, and drying it out.
Drying it very thoroughly, yes.
The biggest, cleaning it and drying it out.
All right, cool.
So that's good. Well, we're going to be getting a hold of Molly soon because we're just about out of bourbon. So it's time to get some more bourbon rolling.
We have more single barrel samples on the way as well.
Excellent.
Unfortunately, because we're still at a point where we can't really get down there. But
right.
Hopefully that changes soon.
Well, if you want me to maybe come back in a few weeks or a couple months, talk about the private barrels when you get them, I'm all ears. Let's do it.
I think so.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and maybe it's something too, which we just did. We just ran a pilot. Is that it could be fun if we could film and do a virtual distillery tour so people understand exactly what you're talking about and how you guys have set up a craft distillery on an extremely large scale.
Yeah, we are working on that. We have a 3D tour. We just need to put the polishing touches on it and things like that. We need to. It's actually a little hard to run on a Zoom. I've tried it before. It is a considerable drain on your computer.
Hogs up a lot of bandwidth, yeah. Yeah,
to stream that. So you need a really robust internet connection. But it otherwise totally could be done, yeah.
All right, cool. Well, Jay, thanks for shedding light on this Backsetter stuff today.
You bet.
I'm glad we got to try the rye. You sent us plenty. I'm glad that a lot of customers got their hands on it. So everybody check back in. There will be some new Benny's single barrels from New Riff, probably early fall, I would guess. Hopefully Jay can come back up and see people in person at some point here. But until next week we have on Wednesday, we have Ian Miller, former distillery manager of Glenfiddich, talking all things Glenfiddich and maybe a couple things Balvenie as well. So Jay, again, appreciate your time tonight, man.
My pleasure.
If you have another question for Jay or something like that, send any questions to spiritsofbennies.com. It goes to Brett and I. If we can't answer it, we'll make Jay answer it for us. All right.
Please do.
All right. Well, have a good weekend, everyone. Jay, thanks again for joining us. Have a good weekend.
Cheers.
All right. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Peated rye.